All right, so we have three people who have decided to share with us today for What's Your Diversity on September 23rd, their stories, or a little bit about their stories at least, with diversity, how it shows up in their life, how they engage it throughout their lifetime. So I'm going to basically ask them a set of questions that should last us for about 30 minutes or so. And then after that, those of you who are here as audience members are welcome to ask them questions, all right? As I always tell each of our guests, if there's a question that is asked, they can always refuse to answer it if they feel it's too personal. So feel free to do that. If you want to ask your question, you can type it into the chat and then I can read it aloud. And or you can unmute yourself and use your voice or get the attention of the interpreter to help sign. All right, so without further ado, I'll ask each guest storyteller just to do a brief introduction before we jump into the question. So your name, what's your role at RIT, if you're a student, what you're studying, and any other little tidbit you might want to share with us just to get us started. So how about we start with Isabel? You're muted.
Would not be a Zoom meeting if you didn't have to start with saying you're muted. Isabel speaking. I am a licensed mental health therapist here at the Counseling and Psychological Service, CAPS. I've been with RIT for about 1.5 years, so relatively new with RIT. And I'm also the co-coordinator within our Office of Diversity and Inclusion Trainings. And I forgot the other half of your question, Taj, I'm sorry.
You covered most of it, unless there's any other general thing you want to share with people, you know, about who you are.
Okay, well, my pronouns are she, her. I am a biracial woman and I identify myself as a Black woman.
All right, thank you, appreciate it. All right, who wants to go next? Jeison or Kerry?
I'll go. So hi everyone, my name is Jeison Perez. My pronouns are he, his, him. I'm a student here at RIT. My major is mechanical engineering technology, and I am a third year. Yeah, I guess that's it.
All right, Kerry.
I guess that means it's my turn. I was telling Taj I'm a little bit nervous, so bear with me, and my allergies are also a little bit all over the place today. So if you see me turning my camera off, I'm either nervous or I'm sneezing. So that's how this is gonna go. My name is Kerry Foxx. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I've worked in higher ed for over 10 years now at lots of different kinds of schools and lots of different kinds of places. Large cities, small cities, big schools, small schools, public, private, and everything in between. At RIT, I serve as the director of the Center for Leadership and Civic Engagement in Student Affairs. Really, I think we have a pretty cool job and I have a pretty good job. It really is to support students' active involvement in the community. And kind of we hope that through interacting with our office and interacting with our programs that students begin to identify things in the community that they're passionate about, that they begin thinking about the leadership skills they need to be active change agents, and they come and actually leverage those skills in support of things and positive change in the community. I got into the field because I was a first generation, I guess I am, a first generation college student. And I experienced firsthand what how a college education can really transform your life. I got to do things in college that I'd never really dreamed of. I interned at places like NASCAR. I'm not a fan, but I got to intern at NASCAR, go figure. I studied abroad. I led organizations, and I really saw, I think I was transformed for the better because of my college experience, and getting into this field was really about me wanting that experience for other students as well. In terms of my education, my undergraduate degree is in business. I have a master's in counseling. from Clemson University, and I'm currently working on my doctorate in educational leadership. So cross your fingers and pray for me because I will need it.
Thank you. Yes, I remember those days. But keep moving forward. All right. So thank you for those introductions. So I guess my first question for you all, if you could just elaborate on, where do you call home? And I frame it like that because some people may have multiple kinds of homes, or home may be complicated. So however you define that, but where do you call home, and tell us a little bit about that place. Anyone can start.
I don't mind. I can go first. So I actually grew up in Virginia, in a really small town. And for me, that will always be home. I grew up around a lot of family. I think I grew up it was a stereotypical Southern family. And so my grandmother on my mom's side is one of 18 kids. And then my dad is one of 15 kids. And so when you talk about a large Southern family, you're talking about me. And I also grew up on family land. And so I was always surrounded by family growing up. But I was also that kid that kind of dreamed of leaving. And I don't know why that was true of me, but I was. I remember we'd always have big family get-togethers, and folks would come in from all over the country. My family had spread out at that point. They would come in from all over the country. And I remember as people were leaving and driving back to what I perceived to be their really interesting lives and really interesting places that weren't, Virginia, that I always wanted to be one of those people. I always wanted to be one of the people that were leaving to go. I always wanted to come back home, but I always wanted to be one of those people that were leaving to go to my much more interesting life in a much more interesting place. And so and my way to do that was to go to college. And so I left home for college when I was 18, and I haven't lived in Virginia since. I've lived in North Carolina. I did my undergrad. I lived in South Carolina for my graduate work. Moved out to Portland, Oregon for a few years before moving to Syracuse, where I lived and worked in Syracuse for 5 years before moving to Rochester about 3 years ago. And so I've lived in a lot of different places in my life. I always still go home for the holidays and whatnot, but I do appreciate the ability to I value my experience living in other places as well. And Rochester, for me, at least in the last 3 years, has really become my new home. It's the first place I've felt like that since I've left home. So.
Thank you. Who would like to go next?
I can go next. This is Isabel speaking. I have always described myself very much as like a Western New York girl. I have a very flat accent, like a lot of us Western New Yorkers have. But I grew up in Buffalo, New York. I was raised in the city of Buffalo. And then around 3rd or 4th grade, we moved to a smaller town, a little bit more east, called Batavia. And that's where I would say most of growing up was like from elementary school till I left for college. It's a small town. Background, like I had some family members there, like similar to Kerry. Like I grew up with like my cousins around. All the friendships that I have now are a majority of the people I went to elementary school with still. And then for college, I moved out to Rochester, and also similar to Kerry, like I had that sense of like, I just can't wait to get out of this town. And so coming to Rochester, I mean, it's not too far away. Batavia is about like 40 minutes away, but it was further enough away and a bigger enough city away to feel like I had gotten out. It definitely was a little bit of a culture shock for me coming to Rochester, but I would say I've been in Rochester now since college, so since 2008, like for a while now. I graduated college with my master's in 2015, and I've been in Rochester ever since. So right now, Rochester really feels like home for me, and there's still things that I'm discovering about Rochester, but I think I've lived here long enough now where I can call Rochester home. I still go visit my family often in Batavia, but for me, Rochester is home.
Thank you. Jeison?
Yeah. When I think about home, I honestly think about my parents, and how I have like a connection to them. But home, like physical home, would be I was born in Dominican Republic. Then we moved to New York, and I've lived in the Bronx for basically all my life. Then I came up here to study college, and I've been here for 3 years. So when I think of a home, I always think of, do I have a connection to my family? If I can contact them, if I can speak to them. So that's what I think about. I can be anywhere else in this world because I have traveled before, but being in a different place, I still feel that connection back to my family, and I feel always at home with them.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So I forgot to, and Jeison did as well, but I meant to add that Jeison is also a student worker, works with me in diversity education. And so for those of you who work closely with students, if those students have ideas on things they'd like to see around diversity education, direct them to Jeison to get that input. So forgot to mention that earlier. So my next question is, how do you define diversity? And has that definition changed over your lifetime or different places you've been in?
I guess I could start. When I first thought of diversity a few years ago, I always thought that it always focused on race, and it always had to do with how people perceived each other, considering that aspect of race. But as I entered college and did many of the activities and diversity programs that RIT has to offer, I started to realize that it's more than just about race or the color of people's skin, but it's more about the perspective of who people are, where they come from, their background. And it definitely has changed. The idea of diversity definitely has changed for me over time. And I've had the opportunity to expand that definition of diversity, which is a blessing, honestly. But to me, diversity is just being able to have a connection to different ideas from different people. No matter like the background that they may have, it may be similar or different. But yeah, I think my idea of diversity has changed, and it keeps growing, honestly, because people keep changing, and we meet new people, I guess, every year. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Isabel, do you want to go? I can go. I'll go. This was an interesting question for me, Taj. I think because I mentioned that I grew up in the South, and when I think about growing up there, my Black identity was very salient to me growing up in the South. And so when I think about diversity as a kid, it was very black and white. I distinctly remember the conversations with my parents about areas of town that we wouldn't go to because of our Blackness. We wouldn't be welcome, we wouldn't be wanted. I remember when I got my driver's license, the first conversation that my parents had with me is the same conversation lots of Black and brown families have with their kids when they get a license: is how do you interact with the police? How do we make sure that you come home alive? And so my Black identity for me was very salient growing up. I think it's not until I went to college that I started thinking about, I think other identities started becoming more salient. My gay identity became more salient then. I realized what it meant to be a first generation student as I was trying to navigate my way through my college experience, and other people seemed like they just knew what they were doing more naturally. Socioeconomics became more important to me. I went to a fairly wealthy private college, and folks just seemed to not struggle in the same ways that I did. I remember I ate a lot of dollar McChickens when I was in college, and I seemed to be the only one, right? And so those other identities definitely became more salient to me as I was going through college. And then since then, I've lived in a lot of places and interacted with a lot of people and learned from them. And so I think my definition of diversity has expanded to just really mean, you know, those things that make us different, those things that make us unique, those things that make us special. And I think what that has meant for me is that I've had to learn to approach conversations about diversity from a place of humility, with kind of an acknowledgement that I don't know it all, that my experience is my experience, and it doesn't necessarily mean that anyone else, that other people have different experiences. And so I've had to learn how to approach conversations with people who are different, with different experiences, from just a place of humility and respect. Like, I want to understand and curiosity, right? Like, I want to understand where you're coming from. I hope that you also want to understand where I'm coming from. So how do we build that bridge?
This is Isabel speaking. Similarly to what Kerry said, so for me, diversity has always meant, or has always been, some kind of difference or opposing of some type of homogenous group. When I was younger and living in Buffalo, I went to a predominantly Black and brown school. I went to a bilingual school where we spoke in Spanish half the day. And so I never necessarily thought about diversity, or it wasn't something that necessarily felt like it was in my life, like in school, for example, because there were so many people who looked like me, but there was a lot of diversity, like at home, obviously, because of my parents being two different races. But for a while, I feel like I didn't necessarily see a lot of opposing or different things to like what was normal for me because of the neighborhood at first that I grew up in, or the school that I went to. But when I moved to Batavia, it was a predominantly white school, and I went to college at St. John Fisher. It's a predominantly white institution. That's when, for me, diversity really meant like difference of races, essentially. Like, I was very aware of constantly being kind of the only brown person in the room, or even starting to realize, especially in college, diversity of like socioeconomic status. I grew up not with a lot of money, and I went to school with people who had a lot more money, and just the diversity of being with roommates who, I remember very specifically having a roommate who had like monogrammed towels. And I just kind of brought like the old towels that my mom wasn't using anymore. And just kind of recognizing the diversity of like, oh, like there are other people around who have more than me. And I would say that carried on into grad school. And even in my grad school class, we took like a diversity class that really taught us about counseling with various different racial groups, as well as different ethnicities and considerations in the context of counseling. But I would say grad school and beyond, I've really recognized and even appreciated very much the diversity of thought amongst being around people who might look like me but think very differently. That's something that I think of more so now, is the diversity of thought in the room, and how that challenges me and how that allows me to grow, something that I really appreciate.
Thank you. My next question is, and some of you already kind of hinted at some of this, but how has diversity influenced your personal life? If you feel like you cover that, how has it influenced your professional life? And then for Jeison, thinking about how has it influenced your, academic career on campus?
I can go first since I haven't gone first yet. So I think I kind of touched on this, but I'll go back. I think in general, diversity affects people's lives as much as they let it. But at the same time, when I think about myself personally, I feel like it's never not been a part of my life. And a lot of that having to do with the fact of the people in my family who are of different races, and just in general, like us being at the dinner table is a diverse, or the Thanksgiving table is a diverse, is diversity. But then also in being in more white spaces, like it becomes more and more present to me sometimes what I represent. I understand that a lot of times the places I go, I will be looked to as being the giving a Black perspective, or possibly filling a quota of diversity for an office, or things of that nature. And especially professionally, what's going on, I find, especially with what's going on in the world right now, like I find being able to bring up diversity and bringing up experiences, especially as a woman of color, is something that I can't just leave professionally, if that makes sense. Like it also comes from a place of like personally, like I'm also personally sharing experiences I've had, and not just talking about ways professionally that we could grow as a counseling center. Like I'm putting my life out there to show examples of why diversity is important, which is obviously very vulnerable, and also really scary at times, that you're leaving yourself vulnerable to sharing all the ways in which some less diverse places have been harmful to me. But I would say in general, diversity has never not had an influence. I wouldn't know how it didn't have an influence, if that makes sense. And I will leave it off to the next.
I guess I can go. I agree with you, Isabel. I don't know what it feels like to not have diversity influence my life, right? I don't know what that feels like. Sometimes I wonder, I think, oh, that could be nice to not have to worry about it, or not have to think about it, or not have to engage it. But I don't feel like I have that choice. And so I think when I was thinking about this question, at first I went to all of I've been really enriched, right, by a lot of really interesting and amazing people in my life. And with lots of different kinds of experiences, with lots of different kinds of backgrounds and identities. And I feel so enriched by them, and by learning about their experiences, and having that be mutual, having them willing to learn and interested in learning about mine. And I've been really enriched by that. So I think that's, for me, diversity at its best, right? And I have also been just hurt and really kind of deeply wounded by the ways in which kind of our society and the systems that make up our society really just, it feels like it just has like a boot on my back and on the back of other people who look like me, who experiences are similar to mine, even those who are not, who are otherized in different ways. And so I think that boot makes me tired. It makes me angry. I find myself exhausted by having to consistently, what it feels like, prove my worth, prove the worth or the importance of the fight, of the battle, of the and for people. I find myself very challenged by people who are just so willing to look the other way and say, no, that's not important. No, you're not doing this correctly. No, you're not protesting correctly. No, you're not grieving correctly. No, you're not. No, you're not. No, you're not. And that is the part of it that has felt to me, almost in spite of the richness and how much I feel enriched by certain individuals who are part of my life, that piece of it feels almost just, there's a sense of hopelessness sometimes that I feel in the space. So I think that it's very two-sided for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also agree with the other two panelists. When I've thought of diversity in my personal life, when I thought about it in my childhood, it was really, I was blinded to it, honestly. Coming from like the Bronx, New York City, I was surrounded by Hispanic and Black culture, and it's all we really knew. It was a really general. I didn't feel like there was diversity, even though there was there. People with different religious backgrounds, different ways of thinking, but I was blind to that. It was coming here to college and experiencing more outside of where I was used to, that I had the opportunity to use diversity to my advantage. You know, I see it as a way to be more open-minded, um, to understand another person, the different lifestyles that there are in the world, and to use that towards working towards something. Um, I've worked on projects with different people from different majors. I think that's a sense of diversity in the way we think. And that's honestly a way that we can achieve a common goal that we need. And honestly, that's why we need these diversity programs or events, because without talking about this, the problems are going to still be there. Nothing's going to change. Like, I was just on campus and just seeing, I was walking by the tiger statue, and just seeing the Black Lives Matter flag just gave me a sense of comfortability here, or a sense of comfort, to know that this is a place, being a PWI, to know that there are people rooting for me, to know that there are people who see the diversity in me and they're willing to put that on the line for me. It means a lot, honestly. And that's why I think diversity is a big influence in my student life.
Thank you. All right, so I have one final question for our guest storytellers. And so that's a signal to those of you who are in the audience to get your questions ready. So again, as a reminder, you can type those into the chat, and then I could read it aloud, or you can unmute yourself when you're ready and voice your question or statement, or get the attention of the interpreter so we can have that translated. Okay. All right. So my closing question is, what are some recommendations, some resources that you might suggest those of us on this Zoom call or beyond to consider learning about in terms of diversity, inclusion, or specific identities that you identify with? That could be podcasts, Netflix shows, music, certain activities in the region to visit, anything, that you want to share with us as possible recommendations.
Sure, I'll go.
Nope, go ahead, Jeison.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess the first thing that one would try to do when thinking about diversity is just to like move outside of their comfort zone. And that means trying to pair themselves with others who may not have the same background or same ideas as one would. And I think that's the most important thing, because that's where diversity is mostly directly. It's communicated between people. Some other like sources of diversity that I've seen, specifically on Netflix, I watched this show called Dear White People. Gives a lot of things that we may not see here at RIT, but it is definitely something that happens in other areas of life, in other places. I've also read the book The Other Westmore, and I know it's a very popular book, but it shares a story about two young men who share the same name but share different fates. While one became a Rhodes Scholar, very successful man, the other was imprisoned, and it just speaks more on that. I guess a movie that really helped me with diversity as hidden figures as well. It gave me a bit of, I guess, intel on the struggles of women in STEM. And I just thought it was a beautiful movie, and to see the hurdles that these women had to jump over to achieve what they did. It was very eye-opening.
Thank you. Isabel, you want to go next?
So I have like quite a few. I know you said 2 or 3, but so the first one I would recommend is a book called Hood Feminism: Notes from the Women That a Movement Forgot. This is a book by the author's name is, I forgot to write it down, but it's a book that I'm currently in the middle of reading, and it basically talks about the failings that mainstream feminism has forgotten, like traditionally ignoring the voices of Black and brown women as well as trans women. And it talks really much about the intersex of like identity in a variety of ways. And so that has been a book that's been really powerful for me in hearing more of a Black woman's voice and how Black women have played a role in feminism and how they've been forgotten about in mainstream feminism. Another book that I'm currently reading is called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy, which I think really, really talks about intergenerational trauma or multi-generational trauma, and how starting from slavery, what has been like inherited trauma that specific, like the Black community still at times plays out or continues with even in society, and even talks about ways that we can heal. A podcast that I've been listening to is called Code Switch. NPR, I believe, produces that, and it talks a variety of topics specific to different types of social injustices that go on, and just a wide variety of things. The other day I was listening to one about the response to Katrina and how it was essentially like reported on the difference between the Black and brown people of New Orleans and white people of New Orleans during the time of that Katrina happened. And it was really interesting. And then a show on Netflix that I think is incredibly helpful for giving voice and giving experience of the Black and brown trans experience, especially ballroom culture, is a show called Poise on Netflix, which it's one of my favorite shows, hands down. Like it's absolutely amazing. But they actually have like, I believe like they have like, they're notable for having a very high like percentage of trans actors actually within the show, like playing the characters who are trans and identify as trans, which is like huge because that rarely happens in Hollywood, as well as like a full cast full of Black and brown people. So those are what I would recommend, and those have been at least helpful for me in continuing to educate and also providing me with some more education as well.
Thank you.
I agree with all of those, absolutely. Pose is one of my favorite shows, and I have learned a lot by watching it about Black trans culture, and things I had no idea about. So I definitely co-sign that. Also, I think what is it called? Dear White People is also just a great show. I think I would recommend, if you haven't read anything by Paulo Freire, I would definitely recommend Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He does center socioeconomics kind of in the way that he talks about oppression, but I think that how he talks about oppression can be very instructive for how we think about it in terms of race in our country in particular. So I think that's just a good foundational text. And I found it was it's one of those books that I felt like I was in dialogue with while I was reading it. So if you haven't read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I would suggest it. I might also suggest, in terms of like your news intake, The Atlantic, I have found, has very thoughtful kind of news pieces about a variety of topics. And so if you're not following The Atlantic, I would suggest it. just as another, to supplement, not to replace, but to supplement kind of whatever you're taking in terms of your media. And you know, and I am one of those people that I tend to appreciate evidence, and I think so often when we talk about diversity, we talk about it kind of in the abstract, but there are actually real world consequences to some of the systems and some of the structures that we've put in place and that we've perpetuated over time. You know, so recently, I think it's called the Community Land Trust and Yale University collaborated and put out a really insightful, troubling, but insightful piece about redlining in Rochester, New York specifically. And then the impact that redlining has had on Black and brown communities over time. So while, you know, white communities have been able to build wealth, right, in the past 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years through housing, right, Black and brown families have not had that same opportunity because of redlining, because of the systematic and legal, right, systems that have been put in place to prevent that from happening. And so I think that when we can land the conversation about diversity, that the things that we do have a real world impact on people and on people's lives. I think the more that we can do that, the better. I think it makes it easier for people to get their heads around. So if you haven't read that piece by the Community Land Trust and Yale University, that partner piece about redlining in Rochester, I really think that you should.
Thank you. Thank you all for those great recommendations. No, I have a few of them in my queue. There's so much good TV out there these days. It's hard to get through all of it. But I'm going to add some of those myself. Yeah, and just to add on to a little bit what Kerry was saying at the end, other people, you will call it the specific, one of the specific documents, the racial covenant or covenants that were in your sort of deeds of houses. So even if you have you have a house right now, you might look at that deed and look at the history and see if there was clear racial discriminatory language, basically not renting or not renting, not allowing folks to buy homes in a certain area because of their skin complexion and identity. Isabel, do you still need Kerry to answer that? Okay, Kerry, question from Isabel is, can you repeat the name of the book for the redlining? Can't hear you. Yeah,
I was muted. I'll find a link and put it in the chat.
Oh, thanks. All right, so now we're at question time from the audience members. So I don't see any questions other than Isabel's in the chat, but does anybody have a question? Again, you can type it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and voice it, or sign and get the interpreter to help with interpreting. All right, I got a question here from Jude in the chat. You're welcome to read along. I will also read it out loud. Thank you for your presentations, Isabel, Jeison, and it's Kerry. I see you type Freddie in there, Jude, and it's Kerry. Oftentimes when
Sorry about that, Kerry.
Thanks. Oftentimes when we talk about and engage in diversity, we talk about programs outside of the classroom, activities that bring different people together. Our curricula do lack diversity. I would like to know, what would you recommend to the faculty to diversify the curriculum and shift it from the pedagogy that privileges power? So another way of framing that, what would be your recommendations for curriculum changes as it relates to diversity and sort of not privileging certain kinds of power? Go ahead, Isabel.
Isabel speaking. That's a great question. I think it starts by one, like recognizing power and taking accountability of that. I know just through the work that we're doing and some of the trainings that we're doing within the counseling center, which I know that doesn't translate to curricula, but just to give you an idea, is we are recognizing the ways in which and trying to identify the ways in which that institutionalized racism and the oppression of certain groups has had on higher ed and access to higher ed and access to mental health treatment, and what is the role we play in that. The last training that we did talked about how specifically in working with Black men and how often Black men are misdiagnosed, and the mistrust between the medical field and Black people in general, and brainstorming ways that we could be able to identify that in the room and talk about that with our clients as a way to help dismantle that. So I would say for curriculum, I would say, like, I think it would be important to read things like White Supremacy in Me, White Fragility, and figure out how that translates into curriculum and being able to identify the barriers that have been put in place of what we learn about as it relates to kind of keeping people of color out. I'm interested to know what my other panel mates would think as well with that.
I've got to be honest, this is a bit outside of my expertise. I'm not on faculty, and so I don't know that I have a great sense of all the various things that go into developing the curriculum that you're teaching in your courses. So I think what I would say is that where you can, I think centering other voices in your curriculum, centering other experiences in your curriculum makes a ton of sense to me. You know, we just talked about redlining in Rochester. So if you're teaching a public policy course, for example, right, that is a case study on how public policy can influence negatively various communities. And let's talk about that, right? If we're talking about public policy, and we can have a really interesting conversation about the internet and the interstate system that was built through the country, right? And the ways in which that system, the interstate system, was built on top of communities of color, middle-class communities of color across the country. And that had an impact, right? And so I think depending on your field, depending on your, kind of what you're teaching, I think trying to find and identify, very specific ways in which people of color or whoever's experiences have been shaped by negatively or positively by the things in your area, but also centering those voices in your curriculum, I think makes a lot of sense. That's probably easier in some fields than others. I don't know, but I think it's worth giving it a shot. I say that with all humility because I'm not a faculty member, right? It's not my role.
Thanks. Jeison, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess as a student, the one thing that comes to mind is trying to understand your student. I'm not saying go to each one and try to interview them and get as much as possible from them, but just being able to acknowledge their difference in the classroom would go a long way in helping them feel comfortable, and helping them understand that you see them. Maybe incorporating different teaching styles, because our backgrounds definitely depend on how we, our learning styles definitely depend on how we grew up, where we came from, and obviously we're not gonna tailor each student a different teaching style, but to spread that across the entire classroom will definitely be beneficial, I believe. And it is something I've seen before and it has worked. And I feel like it would boost participation on a general level or scale.
Thanks. One thing I'll add to that while others are thinking of their follow-up question. I think for faculty in the classroom, having worked with some of them, I think one of the challenges is to relinquish some of your power as a faculty person. I think that's the hard part to do because they're sort of trained at expert in front of the room. I know everything, the students should, kind of listen. Not all faculty members do that, but that's the general training. And so if you're not able to kind of share the space or allow for students to bring in their own perspectives that might challenge yours, that might challenge the field, then I think that becomes the place where it's the hardest to do anything. and all the other things you could do become a little bit more challenging because your mindset may have to shift from I am not the authority in the space. So I think that might be a challenge for many faculty to kind of tackle. Any other questions?
Josh, I wanted to mention, kind of related, one of the things that I think has some promise is really thinking about, are there ways to integrate what's called community-based learning or community-based research into your courses, right? So the opportunity to be thinking about how do we leverage the things that we're learning in the classroom, that students are learning in the classroom, in support of something that is really impacting the local community or communities more generally. I think that if done correctly, and I think that's the important piece, and we have some experts on campus who can support that work, if done correctly, it can be a really good opportunity to integrate issues that are impacting the community here, you know, lots of Black and brown people and otherized people in other part of the community, things that are impacting the communities, and how do you leverage your expertise in support of solutions that that community is looking for, right? I think that's the key. And it's not diversity directly, right? But I think the outcome of that work can be beginning to center other people's experiences. So that's just something else to think about.
Sure. Any other questions?
I think they're letting us off easy.
I think they are. I think they are. Before we close, do the storytellers, any of you have a question for any of you on the panel? No? All right. All right. Well, in that case, I thank you all for attending today. Hopefully you were able to get something from the stories that were shared. I see a lot of thank yous in the chat. Appreciations for what you had shared as storytellers. And I thank the storytellers, our guests, for sharing a little bit about themselves. Kerry, I thought you were natural. You were good. No nerves showed, unless that's when you turn the camera off. But no, thank you all. I appreciate your time and taking time out the busy day to make room for this. All right. So yeah, without further ado, the rest of everyone else have a great day and enjoy some of this sunshine if you can outdoors. Take it easy.
Take care.